I am the greatest. I wish I was 50 years younger and I'd kick your ass. Just stick and move. Waking you up and saying, now stick and move. Keep your hands up.
Welcome to a new episode of the Stick and Move podcast. I'm your host, Trey, and today we're talking about one of the biggest boxing robberies of all time. Strange enough, often one of the most forgotten robberies of all time, which was Oscar De La Hoya versus Felix Sturm. Now, I remember watching this live. I was actually with my old co-host, Sam. We went to a friend's house to watch this fight back in, I think it was 2004 when this fight happened. And we were anticipating Oscar De La Hoya, as everybody was at the time, one of the greatest of all time, to wipe the floor with this unknown boxer. Now, before I break down and show you guys my card, because what I did is I rewatched the fight. And to be honest with you, I rewatched this fight many times over. It's been one of those fights that I've always brought up to people when we talk about greatest robberies, not only in boxing history, but in sports where an underdog gets their shot taken away from them. And I tend to watch it maybe once a year, every other year, but I rewatched it again a couple of days ago, and the story remains the same. Oscar De La Hoya definitely robbed Felix Sturm. Now, before I show you guys my card, now, and the only reason why I say that is because when I watched this fight and back in 2004, there was huge anticipation. You got to understand something. Oscar De La Hoya was moving up to 160 for the first time, and he was kind of looking for that tune-up fight, right? We got to understand something, guys. A tune-up fight, I mean, and by the way, Sturm was a champion at this time. So a tune-up fight back then was okay. That was actually common. You actually took that route to, if you're going to fight a bigger champion at that division, you often fight the lower level champion, which at this time, Felix Sturm was a WBO world middleweight at this time champ. And, he was considered the lower class, as Bernard Hopkins was, of course, the top tier, chopping heads at that time. And we just thought De La Hoya was going to push through. Boy, was I wrong. I mean, yes, De La Hoya won the fight technically, but from an observer's perspective, it was night and day, this fight. Or was it? Because I'm going to show you guys my card. And here is the card. If you guys can see here, I have Oscar De La Hoya 113, Felix Sturm 115. Now, if you've watched our episodes before, we tend to score a bunch of fights, and we've had episodes where we've done that. And like we did Evander Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis, we scored that fight as well. And my whole argument is it really a robbery if you win by a point or two? Okay, so that's what I want to talk about today, because as you guys can see on that score, it was 113, 115. Now, interestingly enough, something that we need to understand about this fight is that, like I mentioned before, De La Hoya was moving up to middleweight. And instantly what I noticed was when he came into that ring, he looked soft. That was the biggest I've ever seen Oscar De La Hoya. And that's why I've never been a fan. Look, I've done an episode already. Is it skills pay the bills, or there are weight classes for a reason? Oscar De La Hoya, you see him in that ring as they do the face-off. You notice that De La Hoya looks a lot softer. And to be honest with you, that's why I've never been a fan of guys jumping weight without a tune-up fight, because, it takes a lot out of your body. There's a lot of speculation of Crawford jumping 2 or 3 classes to fight Canelo. And I'm thinking, like, that's just too much. Yeah, is Crawford more skilled than Canelo? Of course, 100%. But if you're going to jump that many that many levels, that many weight classes to a guy that's naturally at that weight, that's going to be a problem. And I could prove it to you as well. If you remember when Canelo fought Jermell Charlo last year, the one thing I noticed was Jermell Charlo, who is normally a chiseled, stout, strong, agile boxer, came in looking soft because he was trying to meet the weight from 154 to 167. He wasn't defined like he normally is at 154. And you saw the difference. Jermell Charlo was out of that fight completely. He got completely shut out in that fight. Maybe 11-1. You saw that as well with Oscar De La Hoya. I mean, yes, Oscar De La Hoya was only going up one class, but you can tell it took a lot out of him. We've always talked about how weight classes, yeah, for people that have weight issues, 1, 2, or 3 pounds is no big deal. But when you're a boxer and your whole fighting style, and boxing is pretty much based on skill and endurance, amongst other things, of course, those 1, 2, 3 pounds, or in this case, from 154 to 160, those 6 pounds can weigh you down and slow you down. And I saw that 100%. Look, so what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and break these rounds down from 1 through 4. Now, the first 2 rounds I gave to De La Hoya. And something that I did notice was De La Hoya, what I've always appreciated about him. Now, look, I know I've had a love-hate relationship with De La Hoya. I mean, our first ever episode was most overrated boxers, if I'm not mistaken. And I had him number 2 or number 3. I don't remember. So I've come around. When we did a rewatch of the Trinidad, which was one of these episodes as well, when we rescored Trinidad versus De La Hoya, I've never seen such a beautiful performance or a beautiful, technically skilled boxer than De La Hoya. And I retracted all my negative naysayings towards De La Hoya and realized, like, man, I'm embarrassed that I had him on my most overrated list. And I'll say this. When he came out against Felix Sturm, he was aggressive right out the bat from the first round. He goes in and is just peppering him with jabs. But throughout that round, even though De La Hoya definitely outpunched him, I felt Felix Sturm's punches were just more effective. The jabs that Sturm was landing on De La Hoya was just pushing De La Hoya back. It was kind of like every time he was just punching through his guard over and over and over. And I gave that round to De La Hoya because of just the activity. It was a very exciting first round. But for Sturm, when he was connecting, he was just punching through the guard. He was just a naturally bigger boxer. Okay. Going into that second round, same thing. De La Hoya he was like shifting his focus. He was mostly headhunting in that first round to now more body punches. Finishing that round strong, he was mostly active. And I think at that point, what I saw, because I watch these fights on mute, what I saw was Sturm realizing that, okay, I've taken his best punch. I've taken his combination. He is not wobbling me whatsoever. So now let's turn up the heat. And for that third and fourth round, Sturm ran right through Oscar De La Hoya pretty efficiently and pretty fast. It was just, this was one of those fights where there was no spectacular combinations where Sturm was wobbling De La Hoya, or De La Hoya was peppering Sturm to death, and like he normally would, and wilt the strength of Sturm's core. And De La Hoya this was not an exciting fight by any means, where boxers were going down, or there was a hellacious uppercut that whiplashed a head back, or boxer falling into the ropes. It was none of that. It was just a very articulate skill boxing match where honestly De La Hoya's, he was just to that point where 160 his power was gone. It kind of reminded me of De La Hoya, I mean of Manny Pacquiao when he went to welterweight, where he wasn't really knocking anybody out anymore. People were saying that when he went to 147, and I remember thinking this too back then, that for Pacquiao, that ever since he became that religious boxer, he just didn't have that killer instinct. In reality, in my opinion, what was holding Pacquiao back was it was just too much of a high weight class, that he wasn't getting the knockouts that he normally had. That's why he couldn't knock out Jeff Horn and those other boxers in that division. But going back to De La Hoya, his power, because the times that he would connect with Sturm, for boxers at 154 or at 147, De La Hoya would have been wilting those other boxers. And those jabs were going right through Felix Sturm. And Felix Sturm was like, I could take this all day long. Sturm kept on punching through his defense of De La Hoya. But what De La Hoya was doing that was smart, where I can see where there was some kind of manipulation in these rounds, was that De La Hoya was ending the round strong. And Felix Sturm, we're going to talk about this in a minute, would pick up on that. Okay. So that's the first 1 through 4 rounds. They were very exciting. Like I said, was it exciting where boxers were getting dropped and coming back up, or there were these hellacious jabs or uppercuts or hooks or crosses? Not necessarily. It was just that boxers, it was two boxers that were exemplifying their skills. And look, although in my opinion, Felix Sturm won this fight, he did not have the power as well. Even though he was a natural 160, I mean, you can see he was maybe a class too high to where his power could have been more effective. But, it just wasn't that kind of fight. And that's okay. Not all boxing fights are going to be slugfest. It's just not going to happen. So let me go to the 5th through the 8th round. And here I also had it split as well. 5th and 6th I had for De La Hoya, and 7th and 8th I had for Felix Sturm. Now look, most of you guys are going to leave in the comments, so where is the robbery if it's pretty much even? To be honest with you, like I said, this is one of those fights where it wasn't a slugfest where one was completely dominant. It was just more of, what's the word I'm looking for? Any round could have gone anyway. I could have seen this fight where you could have said it was 10-2 for Felix Sturm, or at the very least 115-113 for Oscar De La Hoya, which we'll talk about in a minute. To the 5th and 8th round, De La Hoya was doing something where it kind of felt where Sturm was kind of taking rounds off a little bit. And that 5th and 6th round where I had De La Hoya winning or edging out Sturm, was De La Hoya kept being more active. He was punching the gloves. He kept on throwing many, many jabs, but he was just like love tapping the gloves. He wasn't breaking any guard. He wasn't clear shotting the ribs or trying to hit the liver or anything. I mean, it was just ricocheting off of Sturm's elbows or his gloves. But the times when it came down to those championship seconds of each round where he can steal, De La Hoya would pick up the pace. And then actually in that 5th round, he would land a great 5-punch combo, De La Hoya would, that got the crowd finally moving. It's so interesting because with De La Hoya in his fights back in the days, the crowd was always active. I mean, I go back to the Trinidad versus Oscar De La Hoya. That was a crowd chanting for Puerto Rico, crowd chanting for Mexico, De La Hoya, Trinidad. It was action packed. When De La Hoya fought Vargas, same thing. It was, you felt the decisiveness in the crowd. The crowd at this point of the fight was out of it. There was no ruckus going on. There was no chanting of Oscar like they normally would. It was just people were spectating, hoping that De La Hoya can break through like he normally does. But it was just one of those fights where I don't want to say it was boring, because it wasn't a boring fight. It was just technical. And when you're watching those kind of fights, you're tending to try to find the action, and you're studying more than anticipating the big shot or the big blow. Um, but going into that sixth round, that's when Sturm, in my opinion, at that point, it kind of looked like in the fifth round he took it off, but in the sixth round, it deliberately looked like he took it off. And like I said, De La Hoya would pepper him, not really connecting, but at the very least, there was one point, if there was a little bit of a wobble, where Sturm did connect late with a great left hook. That was probably the most action packed that we saw, or something dramatic happening in this fight. If it just seemed more like a chess bout. Um, but finally, that seventh and eighth round, Stern was more effective. He was being active. He will land a great uppercut on De La Hoya. But like I said, how was De La Hoya responding? Look, going up that extra class, his power was just shot. It was just gone. I know I talk about Canelo a lot. He's right here behind my shoulder. And I'm kind of feeling that the reason why Canelo has not had knockouts as of recent is not because his skill has diminished or he's getting old. We saw how masterful he was with Munguia. I just don't think he is. This might sound controversial, but tell me what you guys think in the comments, especially you, Akeem McCall, the guy who's always challenging me on Canelo, which I love, by the way. I feel like he's not a natural 168 Canelo. I think he's a natural 160. When he was at 160, he was chopping heads, knockouts, 154 knockouts. But at 168, early on, in my opinion, what Canelo was doing in those early knockouts against Saunders and Caleb Plant and well, he didn't knock out Callum Smith, Rocky Fielding, was that 168 division was not they didn't really have a thumper in that division. Here comes Canelo, the first thumper in that division, and I think it caught that 168 division off guard, and he was able to get those early knockouts. But as of recently, he hasn't been knocking anybody out, because I don't think he's a natural 168. Kind of like De La Hoya. Normally, if you watch him at 154 or 147, his jab was so precise and so stiff that he was able to break through guards, and he just couldn't simply do that. Going into that eighth round and the 230 mark, Felix Sturm kept on peppering DLH, breaking his guard, breaking his nose. At this point, De La Hoya was puffy. His eyes were puffy. His nose was obviously broken, which, if I'm not mistaken, he broke his nose in the third round. But what he did that caught my eye was, earlier in the fight, from rounds 1 through 6, De La Hoya had a tendency to try to rally those late rounds, to try to steal. Obviously, he did steal a point, or a point, as to close these rounds. And at this point, what Sturm started doing was beginning the round strong, slowing down, and around the 1 minute mark, start throwing the combinations again. And then finally, those last 15, 20 seconds, backpedal, where De La Hoya was moving forward, trying to land those flurries to try to steal the round. Now Sturm was had a little bit more gamesmanship, moving the chess pieces around and started dancing to avoid De La Hoya getting those points. I don't know if that worked or not, because maybe it could have looked like uh, Sturm was being less aggressive while De La Hoya kept on pushing the pace moving forward. But look, let's get to the elephant in the room. At this point, for the rest of the fight, from the round 7 all the way to 12, I had De La Hoya only winning one of the rounds, which was round 10. Now, this has always been De La Hoya's flaw. This is why I originally had De La Hoya, one of my most overrated boxers originally, because those late rounds he tends to take off. It's bad advice, but this was not the case. At this point, De La Hoya was effective in that 10th round, especially the one round that I gave him. I felt that De La Hoya was more effective. It still could have gone both ways, but at this point, I couldn't hear what Floyd Mayweather Sr. was saying, as Floyd Mayweather Sr. was his trainer, because I had it on mute. But it looked like he was worried, and I actually saw De La Hoya like looking past Floyd Mayweather Sr., sensing that he was about to lose this fight. Now, before I complete these last championship rounds, I want to say something. This was the fight that was supposed to be the step up to the bigger payday, which was to fight Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins was at that fight. They kept on in between rounds going to him. They even had an interview with Bernard Hopkins in the middle of that fight, where he pretty much, gave credit to De La Hoya and to Felix Sturm, but he was saying that he looks forward to beating the hell out of him. But I think this fight was a classic case of a fighter looking forward to the next fight and not really training for the guy before. You see that in all sports. You see that in football. You see that in basketball. You see that in other combat sports where, they underestimate their tune-up fight. I remember when Tommy the Hitman Hearns fought that guy. Oh, I forgot his name. Some Italian guy. Totally underestimated him. I didn't even think the Italian guy had even record. I could be off, but I'm just going off the top of my head. Tommy the Hitman Hearns thought it was going to be a 1 round, 2 round fight, laying a vicious jab to knock him out, and he ended up going the distance. Hearns would win, but he ended up going the distance. This is one of those scenarios where De La Hoya was looking to the next big fight, because everybody was looking forward to the Bernard Hopkins fight. And I think De La Hoya slept on Felix Sturm. He was a champion, and I think that ended up costing him. Now, what I will say for the last 11th and 12th round, look, De La Hoya normally, like we saw with Trinidad, like the way we saw with Mosley for part 1 and part 2 to an extent, was that, and Floyd Mayweather, I'm one of those that believes that he beat Floyd Mayweather. I'll review that fight soon and score it. De La Hoya, in my opinion, he came out. He did not dance around. He did not move around. He did not get bad advice where they were telling him to just stick and move, pun. He was being aggressive. He was throwing flurries. That first minute in the 11th round, he comes out with flurries. They were just not effective, and Felix Sturm was just mechanical. He did not deviate from the game plan. And as a matter of fact, I take that back. In the middle of the 11th round, he actually switches to southpaw, and it kind of looked like in that last minute that De La Hoya kind of punched himself out, because I think there was that stigma that he had already of fading away in the late rounds. I think he was overcompensating, and you see in the early 11th round, well, the entire fight really, he was just being more active than normal, except his activity was just not effective. I know I'm repeating myself. So that final round, the first 40 seconds, both fighters are just clashing, almost in a phone booth. They're finally throwing combinations at each other, and they're connecting. They're not busting each other up. Felix Stern, because he was a naturally heavier boxer, was actually tearing De La Hoya up to an extent. Um, but you know, when the final bell rang, Sturm, of course, was ecstatic. He was excited. He would raise his hands up, thinking he has the fight. While De La Hoya, he didn't celebrate. He just went back to his corner like half defeated. And I think it was a combination of like he was disappointed. He did state in after that fight, if I'm not mistaken, that he trained his hardest, but that Felix Storm was a hell of a boxer. So that's how I scored the fight. The fight would come out, all three cards, all 115, 113, exactly like mine. I promise you guys, I was not watching with audio. We just had the same card. I had a 115, 113. The crowd was not excited that De La Hoya won. You didn't see people jumping in. It was like a mixture of jeers and cheers. It was interesting. People felt and they thought they saw a robbery. Um, I'll say this too. Look, De La Hoya at this time, he was already a seasoned veteran fighting for over 10 plus years in the professional realm, outside of amateurs and Olympics and everything. But look, this is part of his legacy. At this point, the fight before Sterno, it was his loss to Sugar Shane Mosley. That shows you the influence that De La Hoya had. That here was De La Hoya coming off a loss, still getting top billing, one, and two, fighting the number one pound for pound boxer at the time in Bernard Hopkins. There's no denying that he was at the time, because De La Hoya had that pay-per-view pull. He had that excitement. He had the crowd. Good looking kid. As a matter of fact, this is just one of those scenarios where De La Hoya, you saw a legend kind of falling apart. After his second loss with Mosley, he was just never the same again. I mean, after that, he would lose every other fight, literally. He would lose to Bernard Hopkins. He would fight Mayweather, lose. He would fight Pacquiao, Mosley again. And that just goes to show you that all his losses were to top tier legends at the time. Trinidad, he lost to. I mean, as it comes to his legacy, I think he's an all-time great. I've only had that opinion about him as of 3 months ago. So, I used to have him very low because overrated, like I said earlier on this podcast, because he never beat the big guys, the big guys. Now, was he robbed a couple of times? Absolutely. I think he was robbed against Trinidad. I think he was robbed against Mosley, part one, even though they had that epic 12th round. Second fight, I also thought he got robbed against Mosley. We'll talk about that on another episode. And of course, Floyd Mayweather. But look, did his name give him the victory? In a strange sense, I do believe that. Look, like I said, I honestly think that this was just a classic case of him looking forward to the next fight. He says that he trained for boxers he was sparring with boxers that was similar to Felix Sturm, but it was just Felix Sturm was a riddle. Now, let me ask you guys this in the comment section. All judges were 115, 113. I was 115, 113. I'm going to leave it off on this. Is that technically a robbery? Can it be a robbery if the score is 2 points away, or 7-5 kind of fight, 8-4? Because in my definition, a robbery is 12-0, 11-1, 10-2, maybe a 9-3 fight, and the other guy somehow pulls it off, right? I think of Chavez and Whitaker. We did an episode on that as well. I don't know if this is a robbery. I think Felix Sturm took a lot of control over the fight, especially in that middle part and towards the end. But I could see where, because De La Hoya was just so active. I actually have the total punches right here. De La Hoya threw 792 punches, landing 188. I think that's about 24%. Felix Sturm threw 541 total punches and connected 234, but 43%. That's the more effective part. I think the activity, the fact that De La Hoya was pushing the pace. I mean, where do we divide the whole activity versus being more effective? But I had it the opposite score of the actual judges. They had it 115, 113, all for De La Hoya. I had it 115, 113, same score. But for Felix Sturm, I don't know if this is a robbery. I think, oh man, I'm just going to say that there was a clear better fighter, but I don't think it was as dominant as other robberies have been. I'll leave it at that, guys. Go ahead. Tell me what you guys think in the comments. I want to shout out a couple of guys here on my podcast who commented. I recently did an episode on building the perfect boxer. And I want to say I had a bunch of categories: best feet, best jab, best heart, best trash talker. And we have a new commenter at JPL16. He goes, his top defense was James Toney, and I'll admit, he didn't cross my mind, and I'm embarrassed. I was just thinking about Mayweather, because you think of defense, you think about Mayweather and Whitaker. I had Whitaker as my top defensive guy. He had feet for Loma. I consider that too. The one thing that I liked that he did was trainer. I should have done best trainer as well, because that's also a part of it. There was another guy, 540 PTF. He says defense has got to be between Pernell, Floyd, and Rigondeaux. Rigondeaux was a monster in those early 2010s. I agree with you absolutely. Native Wildman 9335. One of our top subscribers. I agree with most of your list. The ones I would have had different is the body from Holyfield and the jab of Larry Holmes. I agree with you. If for me, I picked Anthony Joshua. Holyfield was a close second. I picked for jab Thomas the Hitman Hearns, and Larry Holmes was on my notes too. And lastly, at Yo Tam Dude 5866. In order to give Larry Holmes the maximum credit he really deserves, you got to give him that jab and also add style from him. Nobody had nearly as much stamina as Rocky. He brings in Rocky Marciano. He was never tired. All he did was constantly throw punches, which is true. If you watch those old boxers from pre-World War II and before the 80s, it was all head hunting. I agree with you there completely. Power without letting his opponents breathe. If he wasn't a boxer, Marciano would have been a marathon runner. I agree with you 100%, guys. So go ahead and leave a comment. Tell me what you guys think about this fight. Did I score it accurately? Also answer the question. If winning by 1 or 2 points or 1 or 2 or 3 rounds, is that really a robbery? The real Akeem McCall, I expect a good answer from that. So I'm calling you out on that. And go ahead and like and subscribe, guys. Everything I'm trying to get to 1,000 views, and we appreciate everything from you all. And don't forget to stick a move, baby.
I am the greatest. I wish I was 50 years younger and I'd kick